So there's this pattern that occurs in history, and we've seen it with all kinds of business infrastructure, whether it's electricity, telecommunications, electrical power, transportation, shipping and logistics, whatever the new business infrastructure is. In the early days, and the point there on the left-hand side of the chart, there's very few people who want to have access to it. The folks who do have access to it are the early adopters, and use it for competitive advantage. In the late 1800s, before there was a national electricity grid in the United States of America, large companies or thoughtful companies put their textile and manufacturing systems near sources of natural power like hydroelectric dams, water mills, or they simply put a coal-fired power plant on site. Over time, everybody started to get access to electricity. Now everybody's factories could actually use electricity to automate the tooling inside those factories. This is a very natural process. It happened over about 10 or 20 years, also roughly in parallel with what's happening now. And so what's interesting is as that happens, as everybody gets access to that business infrastructure, again, telecommunications, power, logistics, transportation, specialist companies arise. Those companies deliver that business infrastructure as a core competency. Telecommunications providers, power companies, FedEx, I mean, just look at it. You can see that pattern happening everywhere in history, right? If you as a company right now went out and you said, I'm going to build a new telecommunications, I'm going to build a new 3G wireless network for our company only, right? I'm not going to get into the wireless business, I'm going to build my own 3G wireless network. You would be fired, right? I mean, nobody does that, right? Because there's no competitive advantage. A great example of this, Microsoft Exchange, right? Everybody uses Microsoft Exchange. It's the dominant mail platform. Running your own mail service provides you zero competitive advantage. Everyone knows this, and if you're running your own mail service, you shouldn't be. Even Microsoft knows this. They've started Exchange Online, so now you can consume Exchange as a utility service from the software manufacturer. If Microsoft knows this, then we should all know this. The final stage is where we move to a mature service provider market. And in this market, you can see that the number of people who do it themselves, that this curve goes down. The only people who build information technology themselves in the cloud computing era will be the specialized providers for it, with some exceptions. With some exceptions, of course. Right? This is not going to, but we'll get to that. So we're right here, right? And IT is broadly adopted. Almost all aspects of information technology are very inexpensive. Any business can afford them. And most companies do not go out and build their own anymore. In fact, Manson Semiconductor, a mid-tier enterprise in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was talking to their CIO recently, and they've moved everything to Google. Everything. Their entire order-to-cash process, all of their internal infrastructure, all of their applications are on Google Apps, Google Docs. They're using Google App Engine to actually build new applications. They outsource the entire thing to Google. And that's a mid-tier, $500 million US a year business. And they were able to do that, right? Because their business was to build and test semiconductors. It was not to run information technology. So we see this simple parallel with what's happened with the move from mainframe to enterprise to cloud computing, with the early adopters, peak adoption, which roughly equates to enterprise computing, and the move towards the utility market. And in this model, when you do it yourself, this curve, when you build your own IT, in the early days when nobody else has IT, you can use that IT as a competitive advantage. When we move into the market where everybody's got it, your mail server provides you no competitive advantage. You've got a mail server, your competitor has a mail server, and if you spend the same amounts, then essentially, there's no advantage. You both spend the same amount of money, same amount of value of whatever spent. Now, as we move into this market where there's service providers, somebody can go and get Microsoft Exchange Online, and now they're paying 10% of what you're paying to run your own mail server. Now you're at a competitive disadvantage, right? That's really what's happening. And so the moral of this story, this sub-story here, is that doing it yourself as we move into the cloud computing age put you at a significant competitive disadvantage eventually. If we look at the utility service providers, you can see this for all of them, right? You don't run your own power, you don't run your own water plants, you don't do your own air transportation, you don't run your own banking and finance, and you certainly don't build and run your own telecommunications. You go to providers for all of this. Why should information technology be any different? Right? Except for those things, this is kind of the part of the story where there's exceptions. For every business, there may be some aspects of information technology that are core to your business. It's probably not the mail server, but if you're Chase Manhattan Bank or similar, you have a trading floor that talks to the stock exchange, and it's a mission critical asset. You're not going to outsource that, of course. Absolutely not, right? That's where private clouds come in. The point is that that's the minority of what people spend on IT today. So again, if we look back in history and we sort of say, look at what happened, and there's this sort of phased disruption that happens. So we don't really have any computing, and then in move the large vendors who have mainframes. And we begin that first cycle of disruption. Folks who don't have mainframes, the folks who are not early adopters or cannot afford to purchase their own mainframe, are now at a competitive disadvantage. And IBM, Tenda, Control Data, and a bunch of other mainframe vendors were able to build a pretty successful business model around them. What's interesting about this is along came a new way of doing things that was very different from the mainframe computing paradigm. That's what we call enterprise computing. And there was a whole slew of new vendors. And all of that first crop, that first generation of vendors died. Right? Some of them did survive, but in completely different forms. IBM is a services business, not a mainframe business. Right? Control Data doesn't exist anymore, and I think Tandem has been subsumed within HP. All of those businesses basically had their business model fundamentally disrupted. Right? So now that we're moving into the cloud computing era, we see a whole new crop of IT information technology vendors, many of whom have taken hints from the Googles, the Amazons, and are doing something interesting that is disrupting the current model. I'll give you an example that will be really interesting. At the top here is a technology, open source technology called Hadoop. Part of what makes Google special is that they use an algorithm called MapReduce. MapReduce is patented technology that Google uses, they patented for defensive purposes, in order to do large data processing. You can use that for a lot of data purposes that you would normally use a database for. Hadoop, the folks who wrote Hadoop, said, wow, Google did this one thing, this one cloud computing tool called MapReduce. I'm going to write an open source version of that and bring it to the masses. And this has been repeated ad nauseum. Google has another technology called Bigtable. There's an open source project called Cassandra that provides you Bigtable functionality. Right? So in Amazon S3 and Amazon Simple Storage Servers, you can get OpenStack object storage that is backed by Rackspace, who built their own object storage technology. And this just plays out on and on. Now we have this whole crop of new vendors who are fundamentally disrupting the business models and technology of the enterprise computing vendors. Right? And so if you're depending on these enterprise computing vendors to help you figure out what cloud is, you're going to have a problem because they themselves are being disrupted, and they're having a very difficult time figuring out how to transition. A few are working on it, like Microsoft is very actively working on their online services, the Azure platform, but many don't understand the fundamentals of what's changing, and so they're simply taking their enterprise computing systems and technology, they put a cloud label on it, what's called cloud washing, and they say, here, cloud computing, right? But it's those solutions will not make you competitive. So in this land of disruption, where things are changing dramatically, there are going to be significant winners and losers. We've already seen this happen. So I don't want to talk about the losers. I don't think that that'd be very fair. But I'd like to talk about some of the winners. We talk about Amazon Web Services, but it's critical to understand how fast they've grown. 4 years ago, they had effectively zero or very few servers for the Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud. This year, they have roughly 80,000 servers, physical servers, and 500,000 virtual machines, making them the largest hosting provider in the world in 4 short years. And they appear to be doubling. That means 100% year-over-year growth. Next year, there'll be 160,000 physical servers, $1 billion in revenue, and they'll be running 1 million virtual machines, and they'll be bigger than the largest 3 hosting providers combined. And that's just staggering. That's just amazing, right? So in several years, this portion of Amazon's business will be a $2 to $4 billion business. Google Apps, another great example, also ran for about the same period of time, 4 years, 20 million end users, more than 2 million businesses, and that story that I gave you about Matson Semiconductors, Matson Technology. I mean, this is amazing stuff. I was doing my research for the presentation last night, and I found out that late last year, end of 2009, Rentokil, a large London, United Kingdom company, it's listed on the London Stock Exchange, one of the top 100 there, had outsourced all of its internal IT for applications and mail to Google Apps. 68,000 users, $2.5 billion business, 2.5 billion pound business, excuse me. So this means that everything is changing, right? Everything that we have taken for granted in the past is now up for discussion. The way that we use hardware, the way that we use software, the way that we train people, the way that we think about our data centers, all of those pieces are being reshaped, right? Being completely rebuilt. And so we have to be very, very thoughtful. We can't do the same old thing and expect new results. That will not happen. We have to do new things. That is the only way to stay competitive as the disruption occurs and the landscape shifts. I'll give you some examples of some companies that have had great success being part of the disruption. Netflix is the world's largest video-on-demand service. They serve the US market predominantly. They just recently announced that they outsourced their entire data center operations for their 24/7 by 365, 5.9 uptime, video-on-demand streaming service, and Amazon Web Services. They're using thousands of virtual servers. Thousands. That is their core business, and they outsource it. So I don't know if Chase will ever, take their training floor and put it on Amazon. I think it's unlikely, but Netflix has put their core mission-critical business on Amazon, and it works, and it's working, and it's relatively inexpensive compared to the alternatives that they looked at. ING uses Amazon and Rackspace with a combination of Hadoop to do actuarial data processing, and now is getting back data results in a much shorter period of time than they had ever before. Hitachi in Japan is using Amazon Simple Storage Service to store data that's sent via their mobile broadcasting system. And NASA is using Amazon Web Services to take jobs that used to take 15 to 20 days to run to process images now take only 5 hours. Right? I mean, that's huge business value. So I like to simplify things as much as possible because I think it actually helps our understanding. And for me, there's 2 key benefits to cloud computing. Bottom line and top line. Everybody talks about bottom line, and I'm going to briefly as well, but the most interesting thing to talk about is top line in my mind. But let's talk about bottom line for a second. Microsoft's done a report recently where they actually did deep research on what it means to go and outsource your IT to an external cloud provider. And what they found was that you could have as much as 80% savings. And this really depends on how large you are, right? Obviously, there are some economies of scale. If you're already a very large business, there's less value, but it's still large. It's still tremendous, right? I've heard anecdotally that many businesses are spending several $1,000s a year in US on per user to deliver Microsoft Exchange inside. Okay? Google Mail, for enterprises is $50 US a year a user. I mean, how can you compete with that? I mean, how can you possibly ever build that inside your business at the same cost basis that Google does? I mean, it's not possible, right? So you're looking at these huge order of magnitude swings in value by going and moving non-competitive, moving IT outside that doesn't provide you any competitive advantage, right?